The Thompson family had always dreamed of living in a peaceful neighborhood, and when they moved into Willow Creek Estates, it felt like their dreams had finally come true. The community was the kind you'd see in magazines: perfectly trimmed hedges, colorful flower beds, and streets so quiet you could hear birds chirping in the morning. It seemed like the ideal place to raise a family. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were thrilled about their new home, and their teenage son, Ethan, loved having space to work on his car and hang out with friends. Everything about Willow Creek screamed suburban paradise. But beneath the surface of this picturesque neighborhood lay a web of unspoken rules that residents were expected to follow without question. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, had strict guidelines about almost everything: how tall your grass could grow, what color your front door should be, even how many potted plants you could display on your porch. At first, the Thompsons didn't mind these rules. They figured it was just part of keeping the neighborhood looking nice. What they didn't realize was that some people took these rules way too seriously. One person who stood out among the rest was Greg Pembroke, a middle-aged man who lived 3 doors down from the Thompsons. To call Greg enthusiastic about the HOA would be an understatement. He wasn't officially part of the board, but he acted as if he were its self-appointed sheriff. Every week, Greg patrolled the streets in his golf cart, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes about minor infractions like slightly crooked welcome mats or cars parked a few inches over the curb. He'd then leave passive-aggressive notes on people's doors or send emails reminding them of the rules they'd broken. Some neighbors found him annoying but harmless. Others avoided him altogether, knowing better than to engage. What made Greg unique, or perhaps unsettling, was his obsession with appearing authoritative. He owned a uniform that looked suspiciously like something a security guard might wear, complete with shiny buttons and shoulder patches. No one knew where he got it, but Greg wore it proudly whenever he decided to inspect the neighborhood. Sometimes he'd even carry a walkie-talkie, pretending to communicate with someone important. Most residents rolled their eyes at his antics, dismissing him as a harmless eccentric. But deep down, there was something off-putting about the way Greg carried himself, as if he truly believed he had power over everyone else. For the Thompsons, life went on peacefully for months. They followed the HOA rules diligently, making sure their lawn stayed green and their mailbox matched the approved shade of beige. Ethan spent most weekends tinkering with his old car, which he had lovingly restored with help from his dad. On sunny afternoons, he'd wash it in the driveway, blasting music through portable speakers while enjoying the fresh air. It was during one of these moments that fate intervened, setting off a chain of events no one saw coming. Little did the Thompsons know, their quiet suburban life was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would test their strength, resilience, and faith in humanity. It was a bright and sunny Saturday afternoon when Ethan Thompson decided to spend some time washing his car. The weather was perfect, just warm enough to make the task enjoyable, with a gentle breeze keeping things cool. He rolled up the sleeves of his t-shirt, grabbed a bucket, soap, and a sponge, and got to work in the driveway. Music played softly from his phone, filling the air with upbeat tunes as water splashed onto the shiny surface of his restored car. For Ethan, this was more than just cleaning. It was a chance to relax and take pride in something he'd worked hard on. As he scrubbed away at a stubborn spot on the hood, Ethan noticed a familiar sound, the hum of a golf cart approaching. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Greg Pembroke pulling up alongside the curb. Today, however, Greg wasn't dressed casually like usual. Instead, he wore what looked like a security uniform, complete with polished boots, a cap, and a badge pinned prominently on his chest. In one hand, he held a clipboard, and in the other, he clutched a walkie-talkie that crackled with static. Ethan paused mid-scrub, sensing immediately that this visit wasn't going to be friendly. Well, Greg began, his tone clipped and authoritative. "I see you're violating Rule 14B again." Ethan blinked, confused. "What? What's Rule 14B?" Greg smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. "It's about vehicle maintenance visibility. You can't wash your car here. It blocks the view of any potential hazards for passing vehicles. Ethan stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or argue. That's not even a real rule, he said finally, trying to stay calm. I've lived here for months, and no one's ever mentioned anything like that before. But Greg wasn't interested in listening. He stepped out of the golf cart, his posture stiff and imposing. Don't play dumb with me, kid. I know all the rules inside and out. If you don't stop right now, I'll have no choice but to report you. By now, a few neighbors had peeked outside their windows, curious about the commotion. Ethan felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment and frustration. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he also knew Greg was making things up. Still, he tried to reason with him. Look, I'm almost done. Can we just let this go? It's not hurting anyone. Greg's expression darkened. He crossed his arms over his chest and glared at Ethan. You think you're above the rules. This isn't some free-for-all neighborhood where people do whatever they want. We have standards here. The tension between them grew thicker with every word. Ethan took a step back, holding his hands up slightly as if to show he meant no harm. Fine, okay. I'll finish quickly and move the car afterward. Is that good enough? But Greg wasn't satisfied. His voice rose louder, echoing down the street. No, it's not good enough. Either you follow the rules, or there will be consequences. At this point, Ethan realized arguing further would only make things worse. He turned off the hose, deciding it wasn't worth the headache. But as he bent down to pick up the bucket, Greg did something unexpected and shocking. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a small handgun and pointed it directly at Ethan. Stop moving, Greg barked, his face red with anger. I'm serious about enforcing these rules. Time seemed to freeze. Ethan froze in place, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. The music from his phone suddenly felt deafening, contrasting sharply with the surreal horror of the situation. For a split second, he wondered if this was some kind of twisted joke, but the look in Greg's eyes told him otherwise. This wasn't a bluff, it was real. Terrified, Ethan slowly raised his hands, dropping the bucket with a loud clang. His mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. How could someone act like this over something so trivial? Was Greg really willing to escalate things to such a dangerous level? Without saying another word, Ethan backed away cautiously, his instincts screaming at him to get help. As soon as he reached the safety of his front door, he burst inside, yelling for his parents. Little did anyone know, this confrontation was far from over. Ethan's heart was racing as he stumbled into the house, his voice trembling as he called out to his parents. Mom, Dad, you won't believe what just happened. His mother, Mrs. Thompson, was in the kitchen when she heard the urgency in his tone. She rushed to the living room, her brow furrowed with concern. What's wrong, Ethan? He pulled a gun on me. Ethan stammered, still trying to catch his breath. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief. Who? What are you talking about? It was Greg, Ethan explained, his voice shaking. That guy from down the street. He said I was breaking some fake rule about washing my car. And then he pulled out a gun. Mr. Thompson, who had been reading the newspaper in the den, dropped it immediately and hurried over. Wait, start from the beginning. Slowly, Ethan recounted the entire incident, from Greg's arrival in his makeshift uniform to the moment he drew the weapon. His parents listened in stunned silence, their faces growing paler with each detail. When Ethan finished, Mrs. Thompson didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands trembling as she spoke to the operator. We need police here right away, she said, her voice tight with fear. There's a man outside our house with a gun, and he threatened our son. Meanwhile, outside, Greg was pacing back and forth in front of the Thompsons' driveway, still clutching the handgun. His earlier bravado had shifted into something darker, more unhinged. He muttered under his breath, glancing around nervously, as if expecting someone to challenge him. The once quiet neighborhood now felt tense, with curtains twitching in nearby homes as neighbors cautiously observed the scene unfolding. Greg seemed oblivious to the growing attention. In his mind, he was the hero, a man standing up for order and discipline in a community that desperately needed it. But the longer he stood there, the more his confidence wavered. Doubts crept in. Was he really in control of the situation? Had he gone too far this time? Then the distant sound of sirens pierced the air. At first faint, they quickly grew louder, echoing through the streets of Willow Creek Estates. Greg froze, his grip tightening on the gun as he turned toward the noise. Within moments, 2 police cruisers came into view, their lights flashing as they screeched to a halt near the curb. Officers spilled out of the vehicles, their movements swift and deliberate. "Sir," one officer shouted, his hand resting on his holster. "Drop the weapon and lie face down on the ground. Now." Greg's face went pale. For the first time since the confrontation began, his cocky demeanor crumbled. He looked at the officers, then at the gun in his hand, as if unsure how he'd ended up in this position. Panic set in. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Greg stammered, his voice high-pitched and shaky. "I was just enforcing the rules." That kid broke the HOA guidelines. The officers weren't interested in excuses. "Drop the weapon and get on the ground." The same voice barked again, firmer this time. Greg hesitated, his mind racing. He glanced around, hoping someone, anyone, would step forward and explain that he was just trying to help. But the neighbors who had gathered to watch kept their distance, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. Even those who had tolerated Greg's antics in the past now looked at him with disdain. Finally, realizing he had no choice, Greg slowly lowered the gun to the ground and knelt awkwardly, his hands raised above his head. The officers moved in quickly, securing the weapon and cuffing him as they read him his rights. As he was led to the back seat of a patrol car, Greg continued to protest, his voice rising in desperation. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "I'm not a criminal. I'm part of the HOA. I was just doing my job." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. This wasn't the first time they'd dealt with someone taking neighborhood disputes too far, but pulling a gun on a teenager. That was a new low, even for Willow Creek. Inside the Thompson home, the family watched from the window as Greg was taken away. Mrs. Thompson wrapped an arm around Ethan, her relief evident. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Ethan nodded, though his hands were still trembling. "Yeah, I think so. But what happens now?" His father sighed, rubbing his temples. "Now we let the police handle it. And hopefully this will be the last we see of Greg Pembroke." As the sirens faded into the distance, the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual calm. But nothing would ever feel quite the same again. The arrival of the police transformed the quiet suburban street into a scene straight out of a movie. Neighbors who had been peeking through their curtains now cautiously stepped onto their porches, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. Some stood with arms crossed, while others whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what had happened. The flashing lights from the patrol cars cast an eerie glow over the perfectly manicured lawns, a stark contrast to the usual tranquility of Willow Creek Estates. Greg Pembroke, now sitting in the backseat of a police cruiser, looked like a completely different person. Gone was the self-assured HOA enforcer who strutted around the neighborhood with his clipboard and fake uniform. Instead, he sat slumped, his face pale, and his eyes wide with panic. He fidgeted nervously, occasionally glancing at the officers as if hoping for some kind of reprieve. But the stern expressions on their faces made it clear that no one was cutting him any slack. Meanwhile, the officers worked methodically, gathering details from everyone involved. 2 of them approached the Thompsons' front door, where Mrs. Thompson greeted them with a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. Ethan, still visibly shaken, joined his parents in recounting the events leading up to the confrontation. The officers listened intently, jotting down notes and asking clarifying questions. "So this individual, Mr. Pembroke, approached your son while he was washing his car?" one officer asked. "Yes," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "He started yelling about some rule we've never even heard of, and when Ethan tried to explain, Greg pulled out a gun. It was terrifying." The second officer nodded, his expression serious. "And did he say anything specific before or after drawing the weapon?" Ethan spoke up, his voice soft but firm. "He kept saying I was breaking HOA rules and that there would be consequences. Then he just pulled the gun and told me to stop moving." The officers exchanged a glance, their professionalism masking the disbelief they likely felt. They thanked the Thompsons for their cooperation and assured them that Greg would be held accountable for his actions. As they walked back to their vehicles, they called over to Greg, who was still seated in the cruiser. "Sir," one officer said firmly, leaning down to speak through the open window, "we need to clarify a few things. First, are you aware that impersonating law enforcement is a serious offense?" Greg's eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "I wasn't impersonating anyone," he protested weakly. "I'm part of the HOA. Everyone knows me. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Safe? By pulling a gun on a teenager? That doesn't sound very safe to us, or legal for that matter." Greg opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he sank further into the seat, his bravado crumbling under the weight of reality. The officers continued questioning him, learning quickly that Greg had no official affiliation with the HOA board or any real authority beyond his own inflated sense of importance. While all of this unfolded, the neighbors began to share their thoughts more openly. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived across the street, shook her head as she watched Greg being questioned. "I always thought he was a little overzealous, but I never imagined he'd do something like this," she said to her husband. "I know," Mr. Alvarez replied, folding his arms. "Remember last summer when he left that note about our mailbox being the wrong shade of blue? We laughed it off, but maybe we should have said something then." Others chimed in, sharing stories of Greg's obsessive behavior. There was the time he lectured Mrs. Patel about her garden gnomes, or when he reported Mr. Jenkins for parking his RV in the driveway overnight. Each story added another layer to the portrait of a man who had let his fixation on rules spiral dangerously out of control. Back at the Thompsons' house, the family gathered in the living room, processing everything that had just happened. Ethan stared blankly at the wall, replaying the moment Greg drew the gun in his mind. His father placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You handled yourself well, son. You stayed calm and got out of there safely. That's what matters most." Mrs. Thompson nodded, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "This isn't how I expected our Saturday to go," she admitted with a shaky laugh. "But at least it's over now. And hopefully this will put an end to Greg's nonsense once and for all." As the evening wore on, the police finished their investigation and prepared to take Greg to the station for further questioning. The flashing lights of the cruisers dimmed. And the next morning, whispers about Greg Pembroke's arrest spread like wildfire through Willow Creek Estates. Neighbors who had once dismissed his antics as harmless eccentricity now saw him in a completely different light. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the unsettling truth about how far he'd been willing to go to enforce his warped version of order. By the time the sun climbed high in the sky, nearly everyone in the community knew the full story, or at least their interpretation of it. At the heart of the discussion was the HOA board, which hastily called an emergency meeting to address the situation. The small community center where these meetings were usually held buzzed with tension as residents filed in, some clutching coffee cups for comfort, others exchanging nervous glances. Chairs creaked under shifting weight as people settled in, unsure of what to expect, but certain that something needed to change. When the board president, Susan Myers, stood up to speak, the room fell silent. A retired school principal known for her calm demeanor, Susan wasted no time getting to the point. "We all know why we're here today," she began, her voice steady but tinged with gravity. "What happened yesterday with Greg Pembroke is unacceptable, not just because of the danger it posed, but because it has shaken the trust within our community." She paused, scanning the room before continuing. "Greg is not, and never has been, affiliated with this board or any official authority. His actions do not represent us, nor do they align with the values we strive to uphold in Willow Creek Estates. What he did was reckless and illegal, and we fully support the police in holding him accountable." The crowd murmured in agreement, though a few faces remained tight-lipped. Susan pressed on, addressing the elephant in the room. "Some of you may have tolerated Greg's behavior in the past, thinking it was harmless. Maybe you thought ignoring him was easier than confronting him. But let this be a wake-up call. Silence can sometimes enable harm. If anyone feels unsafe or sees something inappropriate, please report it. We need to look out for each other." Her words struck a chord, prompting several neighbors to raise their hands to share their thoughts. One by one, they recounted instances where Greg's overzealousness had crossed the line, from leaving accusatory notes about minor infractions to making personal threats during heated arguments. Each story added another layer to the portrait of a man whose obsession with control had spiraled dangerously out of hand. Mrs. Alvarez spoke up, her voice firm but tinged with regret. "I always thought Greg was just annoying, not dangerous. Looking back, I realize I should have said something sooner. None of us wanted to make waves, but maybe speaking up could have prevented this from happening." Others nodded in agreement, their expressions reflecting a mix of guilt and determination. For years, Greg had operated in a gray area, unchecked and unchallenged. Now, faced with the consequences of his actions, the community vowed to take a stand against such behavior moving forward. By the end of the meeting, the board announced several measures aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. They agreed to create clear guidelines for reporting disputes and established a system for addressing complaints without involving self-appointed enforcers like Greg. Additionally, they voted unanimously to revoke his access to community amenities, including the pool and clubhouse, effectively banning him from participating in neighborhood activities. As the meeting concluded, residents lingered in small groups, discussing what had been said. Many expressed relief that the issue was finally being addressed, while others admitted feeling uneasy about how close things had come to tragedy. For the Thompsons, who attended the meeting alongside their neighbors, the atmosphere felt both cathartic and sobering. They appreciated the community's show of solidarity, but couldn't shake the memory of Ethan's brush with danger. On the drive home, Mrs. Thompson turned to her son, her voice soft but resolute. "You know, sweetheart, sometimes bad things happen because good people stay quiet. But I think this might actually bring our neighborhood closer together. Everyone's realized we can't let fear or intimidation divide us." Ethan nodded, staring out the window at the familiar streets lined with neatly trimmed hedges and colorful flowers. Though the beauty of Willow Creek remained unchanged, the events of the past 24 hours had left an indelible mark on its residents. The illusion of perfection had cracked, exposing vulnerabilities, but also opportunities for growth. As the Thompsons pulled into their driveway, they felt cautiously hopeful that their community would emerge stronger from the ordeal. In the days following Greg Pembroke's arrest, Willow Creek Estates underwent a quiet but noticeable transformation. The once familiar sight of Greg patrolling the streets in his golf cart was conspicuously absent, leaving behind an eerie sense of calm. For some neighbors, it felt like the lifting of a weight they hadn't realized they were carrying. Others found themselves glancing over their shoulders, half expecting him to reappear and resume his self-appointed duties. But Greg wasn't coming back, at least not anytime soon. The fallout from the incident rippled through the community in unexpected ways. Some residents who had previously kept to themselves began reaching out to the Thompsons, offering words of support or simply checking in to see how Ethan was doing. Mrs. Patel, who lived 2 doors down, brought over a plate of homemade cookies one afternoon, her warm smile putting everyone at ease. "I'm so glad your son is okay," she said softly, handing the plate to Mrs. Thompson. "We should have stood up to Greg sooner. Maybe this will teach us all to look out for each other more." Ethan appreciated the gestures, though he still felt uneasy whenever he thought about that day. Washing his car in the driveway no longer felt like a relaxing activity. Instead, it reminded him of Greg's angry voice and the cold glint of the gun. Still, he tried to focus on the positives, like the way his neighbors had rallied around him and his family during such a difficult time. Not everyone reacted with kindness, however. A small group of residents distanced themselves from the situation altogether, seemingly embarrassed by the drama. These were the same people who had avoided conflict with Greg in the past, choosing to nod politely when he lectured them rather than challenge him outright. Now they seemed determined to pretend nothing had happened, as if ignoring the issue would make it disappear. Their silence didn't go unnoticed, and it left a sour taste in the mouths of those who had chosen to confront the problem head-on. As news of Greg's legal troubles spread, details began trickling in. It turned out that the gun he brandished was legally registered, but using it to threaten someone, especially a minor, was a serious offense. He faced multiple charges, including aggravated assault and impersonating a law enforcement officer. The court case would take months to resolve, but there was little doubt that Greg's life and reputation had been irreparably damaged. For the HOA board, the incident served as a wake-up call. They implemented new policies aimed at fostering better communication among residents, encouraging open dialogue instead of passive-aggressive notes or confrontations. Monthly newsletters included reminders about resolving disputes peacefully and respectfully, along with contact information for mediators who could help settle disagreements before they escalated. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to heal. Still, the shadow of Greg's actions lingered. At the next community barbecue, a tradition the HOA refused to cancel despite recent events, conversations inevitably turned to what had happened. Over burgers and lemonade, neighbors shared stories of their own encounters with Greg, finding both humor and horror in the retelling. "I'll never forget the time he told me my Halloween decorations violated aesthetic guidelines," joked Mr. Jenkins, drawing laughter from the crowd. He actually used the word aesthetic. Who talks like that? But beneath the laughter lay a deeper understanding. Greg's behavior had been a symptom of something larger, a lack of connection within the community. By allowing him to operate unchecked, they had inadvertently created space for his obsessions to grow unchecked. Now, they were determined to do better. For the Thompsons, life gradually returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as possible after such a harrowing experience. Ethan resumed washing his car in the driveway, though he now did it with music turned down low and one ear tuned to his surroundings. His parents kept a closer eye on him, their protective instincts heightened by what had happened. Yet even amid the lingering unease, there was a newfound sense of gratitude. For their neighbors' support, for the resilience of their community, and for the simple joy of living in a place where people genuinely cared about one another. Willow Creek Estates wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But maybe, just maybe, its imperfections made it stronger. Months passed, and life in Willow Creek Estates settled into a new rhythm. The vibrant colors of autumn gave way to the crisp chill of winter, and then the first blooms of spring began to peek through the frost. For the Thompson family, the change in seasons mirrored the changes within their neighborhood and themselves. What had started as a terrifying ordeal became a turning point, not just for them, but for the entire community. Ethan, now more cautious but also wiser, found himself growing closer to his neighbors than ever before. Where once he might have waved politely and kept to himself, he now joined in conversations at the mailbox, or lingered a little longer during weekend cookouts. He even struck up a friendship with Jake, a boy his age who lived across the street. Together, they worked on restoring an old bicycle Ethan had found in the garage, laughing and joking as they tinkered away in the driveway. It was a small thing, but it reminded him how much joy could come from connecting with others. The HOA board continued its efforts to foster unity and transparency within the neighborhood. They organized monthly community check-ins, informal gatherings where residents could voice concerns or share ideas without fear of judgment. These meetings weren't mandatory, but attendance grew steadily as people realized they had a real say in shaping their environment. Slowly, the rigid rules that had once defined Willow Creek began to loosen, replaced by a spirit of collaboration and mutual respect. Greg Pembroke's name was rarely spoken aloud anymore, though his absence loomed large in subtle ways. The golf cart he used to patrol the streets sat abandoned in his driveway, gathering dust. His house, usually immaculate, showed signs of neglect, curtains drawn shut, weeds creeping into the flower beds. Neighbors whispered occasionally about how he was coping with the aftermath of his arrest, but no one sought him out. Whatever lessons Greg might have learned were his alone to grapple with. For the Thompsons, the incident remained a vivid memory, though its sharp edges softened over time. Mrs. Thompson often reflected on how close they'd come to tragedy, and how lucky they were to have emerged stronger as a family. She made a point of reminding Ethan and her husband to cherish the moments of peace and connection they shared. "Life is unpredictable," she'd say, smiling warmly, "but we're stronger together." One sunny Saturday afternoon, nearly a year after the confrontation, Ethan stood in the driveway washing his car again. This time, there was no tension, no fear, just the sound of birds chirping and the occasional shout of kids playing down the block. As he rinsed off the soap suds, Jake rode up on the restored bicycle, grinning ear to ear. "Looking good," Jake called out, braking to a stop beside Ethan. "Thanks," Ethan replied with a laugh. "You know, this car's been through a lot. Feels right to give it some extra love." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I get that. Sometimes you gotta take care of things that matter." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics: school projects, favorite video games, plans for summer vacation. But Ethan couldn't help feeling a swell of gratitude. Life had thrown him a curveball, but it had also shown him the importance of resilience, kindness, and standing up for what's right. As the day wore on, other neighbors joined in, chatting and laughing as the sun dipped low in the sky. Someone brought out a speaker, filling the air with upbeat music. Others set up folding chairs and shared snacks, creating an impromptu gathering that felt less like a planned event and more like a spontaneous celebration of community. Mrs. Thompson watched from the porch, her heart full as she observed the scene. Gone were the days when fear and intimidation ruled their streets. In their place stood something far more powerful: trust, understanding, and a shared commitment to looking out for one another. Willow Creek Estates wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was home. And sometimes that was enough.